Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. The power failed at exactly 2:34 a.m., and Franklin Doss knew the exact time because he'd been staring at the clock on the wall, counting down the hours until his shift ended. He'd been working as a morgue technician at Memorial County Hospital for 6 years, and in all that time, he'd never experienced a complete power failure. The hospital had backup generators that were supposed to kick in within seconds of any outage, maintaining power to critical systems throughout the facility. But on this particular November night, when the lights went out, they stayed out. The sudden darkness was absolute and disorienting, the kind of blackness that made Franklin question whether his eyes were actually open. He stood frozen in the main examination room, his hands still wet from washing instruments, listening to the sudden silence as the refrigeration units shut down and the ventilation system stopped its constant hum. Franklin's first thought was for the bodies in cold storage. There were 7 of them currently, ranging from a traffic fatality that had come in that afternoon to an elderly woman who'd died in hospice care 3 days ago and was awaiting pickup by her family. The cold storage units were well insulated and could maintain safe temperatures for several hours without power. But the longer the outage lasted, the more problematic it would become. Decomposition was always Franklin's enemy, the relentless biological process that he fought every day with refrigeration and chemical preservation. Without power, that enemy would begin winning battles that Franklin had no way to fight. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, using its flashlight to navigate through the darkness. The morgue was in the basement of the hospital, 2 floors below ground level, and there were no windows to provide even ambient light from outside. Franklin made his way to his small office and retrieved the emergency flashlight from his desk drawer, then headed toward the corridor that led to the hospital's main building. He needed to find out what was happening, needed to know when power would be restored, needed to contact maintenance or administration or whoever was responsible for getting the generators online. The corridor was as dark as the morgue, and Franklin's footsteps echoed off the concrete walls in a way that made the space feel larger and more ominous than it did during normal operations. He reached the stairwell and climbed to the ground floor, where he expected to find emergency lighting and staff dealing with the crisis. Instead, he found more darkness and an eerie quiet that suggested the entire hospital had been affected by the outage. This made no sense. Hospitals had redundant backup systems specifically to prevent this kind of situation. Even if the main generators failed, there should be battery-powered emergency lights throughout the building. Franklin found a nurse's station on the ground floor, where 3 nurses were using their phones as flashlights and trying to reach maintenance on the internal phone system. "The whole hospital is down," one of them told Franklin. "And the phones aren't working either, not even the landlines. Something's wrong with the backup systems. They're saying it might take hours to fix." Hours. Franklin felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Hours meant the cold storage units would start warming up, meant decomposition would accelerate, meant he'd have work to do that he didn't want to think about. But there was nothing he could do except wait and hope that the power came back sooner than expected. He returned to the morgue, using his flashlight to navigate the familiar space that felt suddenly foreign in the darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by his own breathing and footsteps. Franklin had never realized how much ambient noise the equipment generated until it was gone. The constant hum of refrigeration, the whisper of ventilation, the occasional click and beep of monitoring systems. All of it had formed a soundtrack that he'd taken for granted. Without it, the morgue felt dead in a way that went beyond the bodies in storage, as if the space itself had ceased to function. he decided to do a visual check of the cold storage units to ensure that all the doors were properly sealed and that nothing had been disturbed by the power failure. He made his way to the storage room, a space about 20 feet square with 8 individual refrigeration units lining the walls. Each unit was essentially a large drawer, capable of holding 1 or 2 bodies depending on size, maintained at a constant 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Franklin checked each unit systematically, pulling the handles to ensure they were securely latched, verifying by touch that the seals were intact. It was when he reached Unit 5 that he noticed something wrong. The handle moved too easily when he tugged on it, and the drawer slid open several inches before he could stop it. That shouldn't have been possible. The drawers had locking mechanisms that engaged automatically when they were closed, and they couldn't be opened from the inside. Franklin pulled the drawer open fully, shining his flashlight inside, and felt his breath catch in his throat. The drawer was empty, completely empty, with no body bag, no personal effects, nothing to indicate that anyone had ever been stored there. Franklin's mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe he'd miscounted the bodies. Maybe Unit 5 had been empty all along, and he'd simply forgotten. He pulled out his phone and checked his intake log, scrolling to the most recent entries. According to his records, Unit 5 should have contained the body of a middle-aged male, identified as Robert Chen, who died of a heart attack 2 days ago. The body had been brought in by paramedics at 6 o'clock p.m. on Monday evening, and Franklin had personally processed the intake, photographed the body, and logged everything according to standard protocols. There was no chance he'd made a mistake about which unit he'd used. He checked the other units systematically, pulling each drawer open and verifying the contents against his log. Units 1 through 4 and 6 through 8 all contained the bodies he expected to find. Each one properly bagged and tagged, each one exactly where it should be. Only Unit 5 was empty, the space where Robert Chen should have been now containing nothing but the cold metal surface of the drawer. Franklin stood in the darkness, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Bodies didn't just disappear. They were heavy, awkward, difficult to move without equipment and training. And who would have taken a body from the morgue? For what possible reason? His first thought was that someone from the funeral home had picked up the body and he'd somehow forgotten to log the release. But that didn't make sense. Funeral homes didn't make pickups in the middle of the night, and certainly not during a power outage. And even if they had, Franklin would have had to unlock the cold storage unit and sign release papers and update his log. There would be documentation, a paper trail, evidence that the transfer had occurred. He checked his office files looking for any release forms he might have processed and forgotten about but found nothing. According to all official records, Robert Chen's body should still be in Unit 5. Franklin's next thought was theft, though the idea seemed absurd. What would anyone want with a dead body? There were black market uses for cadavers, medical research programs that operated in gray areas of legality, but those thefts typically targeted unclaimed bodies or bodies with specific characteristics. Robert Chen had family, had been positively identified, and was scheduled for pickup by a funeral home the following afternoon. There was nothing particularly valuable about his body that would motivate theft, and breaking into a hospital morgue during a power outage seemed like an incredibly risky way to obtain a cadaver when there were easier targets available. He needed to report this to someone, needed to get security involved and start documenting what had happened. But before he could leave the storage room, he heard something that made him freeze. It was a sound like metal scraping against metal, coming from somewhere in the darkness behind him. Franklin spun around, his flashlight cutting through the blackness, illuminating the empty corridor that led back to the examination room. He saw nothing, but the sound came again, definitely metal on metal. like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. "Hello?" Franklin called out, his voice sounding small and uncertain in the darkness. "Security? Is someone there?" No response, just that scraping sound continuing, growing slightly louder as whatever was making it moved closer. Franklin's rational mind told him it was probably just the building settling, or pipes contracting as temperatures changed, or some other mundane explanation. Old buildings made all kinds of noises, especially in the quiet of early morning, but his instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong, that he needed to leave the morgue immediately and get help. He moved toward the corridor, keeping his flashlight trained ahead of him, sweeping the beam back and forth to illuminate as much of the space as possible. The examination room appeared empty, the steel tables and equipment exactly where they should be. But as Franklin's light passed over the far corner of the room, he saw something that made his heart hammer in his chest. There were wet footprints on the tile floor, leading from the direction of the cold storage room toward the exit. Not shoe prints, but bare footprints. The kind that might be left by someone walking with wet feet, or by someone who'd been lying in a refrigerated drawer for 2 days and whose skin was still cold and slightly damp with condensation. Franklin told himself he was being ridiculous, that there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe someone from maintenance had come through earlier. Maybe one of the cleaning staff had walked through in bare feet for some reason. But the footprints were fresh, the water still glistening in his flashlight beam, and they definitely hadn't been there when he'd arrived for his shift 6 hours ago. He followed them with his light, watching as they led across the examination room, through the doorway, and into the corridor that led to the main hospital. That's when he remembered Walt Crenshaw, the security guard who was supposed to be making rounds through the basement. Walt was a former Marine who'd been working hospital security for 15 years, a solid and reliable presence who Franklin had always felt comfortable working alongside. If something strange was happening in the morgue, Walt would know about it, would have explanations and procedures and backup. Franklin needed to find Walt immediately, needed to report the missing body and the footprints and get help figuring out what was going on. He made his way back up to the ground floor, moving quickly now, his earlier caution replaced by urgency. The hospital was still dark, still eerily quiet, but Franklin could hear voices in the distance, staff members calling to each other and trying to coordinate their response to the power outage. He found Walt in the main lobby, using a battery-powered radio to communicate with security dispatch. The guard looked up as Franklin approached, his expression shifting from professional calm to concern as he registered Franklin's agitation. "We've got a problem in the morgue," Franklin said, trying to keep his voice steady. "One of the bodies is missing from cold storage, and there are footprints, wet footprints, leading out of the facility." Walt stared at him for a moment, processing this information, then spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup in the basement morgue. Possible security breach. Send everyone available." He clipped the radio to his belt and gestured for Franklin to lead the way. "Show me," he said simply, his tone all business. They descended together into the darkness, Walt carrying a heavy-duty flashlight that threw a much brighter beam than Franklin's. The security guard swept the light methodically as they moved, checking corners and doorways with the practiced efficiency of someone trained for tactical situations. When they reached the morgue, Walt examined the wet footprints carefully, kneeling to look at them from different angles. "These are definitely fresh," he confirmed, "and they're human, adult-sized, no shoes. You said a body is missing?" Franklin led him to the cold storage room and pulled open Unit 5, showing him the empty drawer. Walt examined it carefully, checking the locking mechanism and the seal around the door. "This was opened from the outside," he said. "The lock isn't broken, but it's disengaged. Someone with access could have opened it, but why would staff remove a body in the middle of a power outage without documenting it?" Franklin shook his head, having no answer that made sense. Walt pulled his radio again. "Dispatch, I need you to check the security logs. Has anyone accessed the basement morgue in the last 2 hours besides Franklin Doss?" The response came back after a moment of static. "Negative. Franklin's keycard was the last one to access that area at the start of his shift. No other entries logged since then." Walt looked at Franklin with an expression that might have been suspicion or concern or both. "Is there any other way into this facility? Emergency exits, service entrances, anything that wouldn't register on the keycard system?" Franklin thought about it, trying to remember every detail of the morgue's layout. "There's a loading dock entrance we use for body pickup and delivery, but it's got an alarm that triggers if it's opened from the inside, and it should be locked from the outside unless someone with authorization opens it." "Let's check it," Walt said, and they made their way to the loading dock, a small garage-like space at the far end of the morgue where funeral homes and transport services brought bodies in and took them out. The roll-up door was closed and appeared secure, but when Walt tried the regular entry door next to it, it opened easily. The alarm that should have sounded remained silent, another system disabled by the power outage. Walt shone his flashlight into the loading dock area, illuminating tire tracks on the concrete floor that looked fresh. "Someone's been here recently," he said. "Could be whoever delivered that last body. When was the most recent intake?" Franklin checked his phone log. "Monday evening, 6:00 p.m. It's 6 p.m., the traffic fatality. That's almost 30 hours ago." Walt nodded slowly, his jaw tight with tension. "So, these tracks are too fresh to be from that delivery. Someone's been here tonight, during the outage. Someone who knew the alarm would be disabled, and they could get in without triggering security." He spoke into his radio again, requesting that security review any exterior camera footage that might show activity around the loading dock, though Franklin doubted any cameras would have been functioning during the power outage. They returned to the main morgue area, where 2 more security guards had arrived in response to Walt's call for backup. Walt briefed them quickly on the situation: missing body, unexplained footprints, possible unauthorized entry through the loading dock. The guards fanned out to search the basement level, looking for any sign of the missing body or whoever might have taken it. Franklin stood in his office, feeling useless and increasingly unsettled by the whole situation. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. The morgue was a place of order and procedure, of careful documentation and respectful handling of the deceased. Bodies didn't disappear, and security protocols weren't supposed to fail. One of the security guards called out that he'd found something, and they all converged on a storage closet near the examination room. Inside, behind some boxes of supplies, they found a body bag. It was empty, unzipped, and discarded, but Franklin recognized it immediately as one of theirs. Each morgue body bag had a unique barcode tag, and this one matched the tag that should have been attached to Robert Chen's body. Walt examined the bag carefully, noting that it showed no signs of damage or forced opening. "Someone unzipped this normally and removed the body," he said. "This isn't theft in the conventional sense, this is methodical, planned." Franklin's mind kept circling back to those wet footprints, to the impossible implication they suggested. He knew it was insane, knew that dead bodies didn't get up and walk out of cold storage, but he also couldn't explain what he was seeing through any rational framework. He decided to check something, pulling out his phone and accessing the intake photos he'd taken of Robert Chen's body when it first arrived. He scrolled through the images, studying the man's features and physical characteristics. Chen had been in his late 40s, average height and build, with no distinguishing marks or tattoos. The cause of death was cardiac arrest, confirmed by the paramedics who'd responded to the 911 call from Chen's apartment. "Wait," Franklin said, something clicking in his mind. The paramedics' report mentioned that Chen had been dead for at least an hour before they arrived. His neighbor called it in, said she heard a loud thump from his apartment and went to check on him. When she found him, he was already cold. Walt looked at him with interest. So? Franklin scrolled through his notes, finding the detail that had caught his attention. So, Chen's body was cold when it arrived here. Much colder than it should have been if he'd only been dead for an hour or two. I remember thinking it was odd at the time, that maybe the apartment had been really cold or something. But his core temperature was unusually low, even for a recent death. Walt considered this. You think something was wrong with the body before it got here? That maybe Chen wasn't actually dead? Franklin shook his head. No, he was definitely dead. I verified absence of vital signs, checked for rigor mortis, did everything by protocol. There's no way he was alive when he came in here. But even as he said it, Franklin felt a creeping doubt. He'd been working in the morgue for 6 years, had processed hundreds of bodies, and he'd never made a mistake about whether someone was actually deceased. But there were edge cases he'd heard about. Rare conditions where people appeared dead but weren't, where metabolic processes slowed to the point that they mimicked death. The power came back on suddenly, fluorescent lights flickering to life and filling the morgue with their harsh illumination. The refrigeration units hummed back to life, and the ventilation system resumed its constant whisper. The normal sounds and lights of the facility should have been comforting, but instead they made Franklin more aware of how violated the space felt, how the careful order of his workplace had been disrupted by something he didn't understand. Walt's radio crackled with traffic as security dispatch came back online, coordinating the hospital's response to the extended outage. Walt listened to the radio chatter for a moment, then looked at Franklin with an expression that suggested he'd heard something significant. Dispatch says there's been an incident on the 3rd floor. A patient wandered away from his room during the outage and hasn't been located yet. They're doing a floor-by-floor search. Franklin felt his stomach drop. What kind of patient? Walt spoke into his radio requesting details, and the response confirmed Franklin's worst fear. Male patient, late 40s, admitted through the ER Monday evening with suspected cardiac arrest. Stabilized and moved to intensive care for observation. During the power outage, he apparently disconnected his monitors and left his room. Staff is trying to figure out how he got past the nursing station without being seen. Franklin and Walt looked at each other, the implications settling over them like a weight. Robert Chen wasn't dead, Franklin said quietly. Or he was dead, and then he wasn't. Somehow, between the time he arrived here and now, he either revived or was never dead to begin with. Walt shook his head slowly. That's not possible. You said you verified death, followed all the protocols. And even if there was some mistake, how would he have gotten from the morgue to the ICU? Did someone realize the error and move him without documenting it? Franklin pulled up his intake records again, looking for something he might have missed. The paramedic report clearly stated that Chen had been found unresponsive in his apartment, with no pulse and no respirations. They'd performed CPR and used an AED, but gotten no response. Chen had been declared dead at the scene by the responding paramedics, who'd then transported his body to the hospital morgue as per standard protocol. There should have been no confusion about his status. He was dead, officially and definitively, when he arrived in Franklin's care. We need to check the security footage, Walt said. Even though the power was out, some of our cameras have battery backup that should have kept them recording. If Chen somehow got from the morgue to the ICU, we'll have video of it. They made their way to the security office, where a tech was already reviewing footage from the outage period. Walt explained what they were looking for, and the tech pulled up multiple camera feeds, displaying them on a wall of monitors. Most of the cameras had gone dark during the outage, but a few key locations had maintained recording thanks to backup batteries. One of those locations was the corridor outside the morgue. The tech pulled up that footage, starting from about 30 minutes before the power failure. For a while, nothing happened. The corridor was empty, the timestamp ticking forward. Then, at exactly 2:34 a.m., the lights went out, and the image quality degraded significantly as the camera switched to battery power and infrared recording. The corridor appeared in murky green and black, the infrared illuminators casting strange shadows that made everything look ghostly and surreal. At 2:41 a.m., something moved in the frame. A figure emerged from the morgue entrance, moving slowly and unsteadily. In the infrared footage, it was difficult to make out details, but the figure appeared to be male, naked or nearly so, moving with the stiff gait of someone in pain or disoriented. The figure paused, seeming to look around, then moved toward the stairwell that led to the upper floors. "That's our missing person," Walt said grimly. "That's Chen or someone, leaving the morgue during the outage." The tech switched to other camera feeds, tracking the figure's progress through the hospital. The footage was sporadic, with long gaps where the figure moved through areas without battery backup cameras. But they caught glimpses of him at various points, struggling up the stairs to the ground floor, moving through a hallway near the emergency department, finally entering a stairwell that led to the intensive care unit. The timestamp on the last footage was 3:02 a.m., which meant Chen had spent nearly half an hour making his way from the morgue to the ICU. "But how did he get into a patient room?" Franklin asked. "The ICU is secured, with nursing staff at the central station. Someone would have seen him." The security tech shook his head. "Not necessarily. During the power outage, the automatic doors weren't working properly. The ICU staff was dealing with emergency protocols, making sure critical patients had backup ventilation and monitoring. In that chaos, someone could have slipped past without being noticed, especially if they knew where they were going." Walt made a call on his radio, speaking directly to the security supervisor who was coordinating the search for the missing ICU patient. "I need you to check something. Does the patient who wandered away from the ICU match the description for a Robert Chen who was brought to the morgue Monday evening?" There was a pause, the sound of the supervisor checking records, and then the response came back. "Affirmative, patient in ICU room 347 is listed as Robert Chen, admitted Monday evening with cardiac arrest. According to his chart, he was brought to the ER by paramedics who'd been unable to resuscitate him. ER staff got a pulse back and moved him to ICU for monitoring. He was stable when the power went out." Franklin felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "That's impossible. Chen's body was in my morgue. I processed his intake, stored him in Unit 5. There's no way he could have been in the ICU at the same time." Walt looked at the security tech. "Pull up footage from the ER Monday evening, around 6 o'clock p.m. Let's see what actually happened when that body arrived." The tech complied, navigating through archived footage until he found the relevant time period. The loading dock camera showed a paramedic unit arriving at 6:04 p.m., with 2 medics unloading a gurney that carried a body bag. They watched as the paramedics wheeled the gurney into the hospital through the ER entrance. The tech switched to ER cameras, following the gurney's progress. Instead of heading to the morgue, the gurney was taken to a trauma bay, where ER staff immediately began working on the body. Franklin watched in confusion as doctors performed CPR, administered medications, and used a defibrillator. After several minutes of intense activity, the monitors showed signs of life: a heartbeat, respirations, vital signs stabilizing. The patient, who should have been dead, was alive. They resuscitated him in the ER, Walt said. But if Chen was revived in the ER, then whose body did you process in the morgue? Franklin felt a chill run down his spine. I don't know. The paramedics brought the body bag directly to me, or at least I thought they did. But if Chen was taken to the ER, then someone else brought me a different body. He tried to remember the details of that intake, tried to picture the paramedics who'd delivered the body. But his memory was frustratingly vague. It had been a routine delivery, one of dozens he'd processed in recent weeks, and he hadn't paid particular attention to the details. The security tech pulled up more footage, this time focusing on the morgue loading dock for Monday evening. At 6:47 p.m., 43 minutes after Chen had been taken to the ER, another vehicle arrived at the loading dock. This one wasn't a paramedic unit, but an unmarked white van. 2 people in hospital scrubs emerged from the van, unloaded a gurney with a body bag, and wheeled it into the morgue. Franklin appeared in the footage moments later, meeting the people at the entrance and accepting the delivery. In the footage, Franklin could see himself checking paperwork and helping to transfer the body to a morgue gurney. The entire exchange took less than 5 minutes. I don't remember that, Franklin said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't remember those people or that van. I remember the paramedics bringing Chen's body directly from the scene, but that's not what this footage shows. Walt put a hand on his shoulder. During the power outage, did you hit your head or lose consciousness at any point? Could you have been confused about which body you processed? Franklin shook his head emphatically. No, I was completely lucid. I remember the intake, remember processing the body, remember storing it in Unit 5. But the details don't match what I'm seeing in this footage. The security supervisor arrived at that moment, looking harried and concerned. We found Chen, he reported. He's back in his ICU room. Claims he doesn't remember leaving, doesn't know how he got disconnected from his monitors. Medical staff is evaluating him now, but he appears physically fine apart from being confused and disoriented. Walt thanked the supervisor, then turned back to Franklin. So, we have 2 mysteries here. First, who brought you that body on Monday evening, and whose body was it? Second, where's that body now, and how did it leave the morgue during the power outage? Franklin thought about the footprints, about the empty body bag, about the figure in the infrared footage. What if it was the same person? He said slowly. What if whoever brought that body to me was setting up something, using the morgue as a staging area for something else? And then during the power outage, when security systems were down, they came back and removed the body? Walt considered this. But why? What's the point of bringing a body to a morgue just to remove it hours later? And whose body was it? The security tech had continued reviewing footage, and now he called their attention to something he'd found. You need to see this, he said, pulling up footage from one of the exterior cameras that had battery backup. The camera covered the ambulance bay near the ER, and the footage was from 3:17 a.m. during the power outage. The same white van that had delivered the body to the morgue on Monday evening pulled up to the ambulance bay. 2 people in scrubs emerged, opened the back doors of the van, and loaded something inside. The footage was murky, and the angle wasn't ideal, but it appeared to be a gurney with something on it, possibly a body. The van drove away, and the tech froze the frame on the license plate. I can run this plate, he said, typing on his keyboard. The results came back within moments. Van is registered to a private medical transport company called Lazarus Services, based out of Portland, licensed for non-emergency medical transport and organ procurement. Walt wrote down the information. I'll contact Portland PD, have them check out this company. In the meantime, we need to document everything that happened here and get statements from everyone involved. Franklin spent the next several hours going over his recollection of events with the hospital administration, security supervisors, and eventually local police who were called in to investigate. He told them everything he could remember, though his memories felt increasingly unreliable. The more he tried to recall specific details about Monday evening's intake, the more confused he became. Had he actually processed a body that night? Or had someone manipulated him somehow, made him think he'd done his usual intake protocols when something else had actually happened? The police investigation into Lazarus Services revealed that the company existed on paper, but had no actual physical location. The address listed on their business registration was a mailbox service in Portland, and the phone number went to a voicemail that was never returned. The van's license plate belonged to a vehicle that had been reported stolen 3 weeks earlier from a medical facility in Seattle. Whoever had brought that body to the morgue and then retrieved it during the power outage had covered their tracks carefully, leaving no trail that police could follow. As for Robert Chen, he recovered fully from his cardiac episode and was discharged from the hospital a week later. Franklin interviewed him before he left, trying to understand what had happened Monday evening. Chen's memory of events was fragmentary. He remembered feeling chest pain in his apartment, remembered calling 911, and then nothing until he woke up in the ICU 2 days later. He had no memory of dying, no memory of being revived, no memory of the time his body supposedly spent in the morgue. Medical staff couldn't explain his recovery. By all accounts, he should have been dead. The paramedics' report was clear about finding him without vital signs, about their unsuccessful attempts at resuscitation. Yet somehow, in the ER, his heart had started beating again. Franklin requested and received a week of leave after the incident. He needed time to process what had happened, to reconcile his memories with the objective evidence captured on security footage. He watched the footage over and over, studying the people who delivered and retrieved the mysterious body, trying to find some detail that would explain their actions. But the footage was frustratingly unclear. The people wore surgical masks and kept their faces down, avoiding clear identification. They moved with the efficiency of medical professionals, knew exactly where to go and what to do. When Franklin returned to work, he found that his perspective on the morgue had fundamentally changed. He'd always thought of it as a place of certainty, where the dead were dead and the living were elsewhere. But now he understood that the boundaries were less clear than he'd believed. Bodies that should be dead sometimes weren't. People who should know what happened in their workplace sometimes had memories that didn't match reality. And the morgue, for all its protocols and procedures, was as vulnerable to manipulation as any other part of the hospital. Walt Crenshaw seemed to share this unease. The security guard made more frequent rounds through the basement, checked the cold storage units multiple times per shift, and insisted on new protocols for accepting body deliveries. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, Walt told Franklin one night, and I've never felt like the hospital wasn't secure. But after what happened, I realized that security is an illusion. If someone wants to get in badly enough, if they have the right knowledge and timing, they can do whatever they want. All we can do is try to notice and respond." The investigation into Lazarus Services eventually went cold. Police traced some of the company's financial transactions to offshore accounts that led nowhere. They interviewed staff at other medical facilities to see if similar incidents had occurred, but found nothing conclusive. The prevailing theory was that someone was using the morgue as a way station for trafficking stolen bodies, possibly for black market organ sales or illegal medical research. But without evidence or witnesses, there was nothing to prosecute. Franklin started keeping his own records, documenting every body that came through the morgue with photographs and detailed notes that went beyond standard protocols. He cross-referenced his records with hospital admissions, verified the identity of everyone who delivered or picked up bodies, and maintained his own database independent of the hospital's official system. If something like this happened again, he wanted to have evidence that couldn't be questioned or manipulated. Trust, he'd learned, was a luxury he could no longer afford. 6 months after the power outage incident, Franklin was working a night shift when he received a delivery from a medical transport service he'd never heard of. The delivery person was professional and had all the proper paperwork, but something about the interaction made Franklin's instincts flare with warning. He processed the intake according to protocol, but afterward, he pulled the security footage and studied the transport vehicle. It was a different van, a different company name, but the license plate was registered to the same mailbox service in Portland that Lazarus Services had used. Franklin called Walt immediately, and together they examined the body that had just been delivered. According to the paperwork, it was an elderly man who'd died in a nursing home. A routine case with no red flags. But when Franklin looked closely at the body's hands, he noticed something odd. The fingertips were smooth, lacking the prints that should have been there. It was the same condition he'd heard about but never seen, adermatoglyphia, the genetic absence of fingerprints. The coincidence was too specific to be accidental. Someone was sending Franklin a message, letting him know they could access the morgue whenever they wanted, deliver whatever they wanted, and there was nothing he could do about it. Walt wanted to reject the delivery, to refuse to accept the body until they could verify its origin. But Franklin stopped him. If we refuse, they'll just come back another way, another time. At least this way we know the body is here. We can monitor it, document everything, maybe learn something about who's doing this. Walt reluctantly agreed, and they moved the body into cold storage, into Unit 5, the same unit where the mysterious body from 6 months ago had been stored. Franklin set up a camera in the storage room, a small wireless unit that would record directly to his phone, giving him continuous monitoring outside the hospital's official security system. For 3 days, nothing happened. The body remained exactly where Franklin had placed it, and no one attempted to access the morgue outside of normal operations. Franklin began to think maybe he'd been paranoid, reading significance into coincidences that meant nothing. But on the 4th night, at 2:34 a.m. exactly, the same time the power had failed 6 months earlier, Franklin's phone alert went off. Motion detected in the cold storage room. He was in his office at the time, catching up on paperwork, and he grabbed his flashlight and ran toward the storage room, his heart pounding with adrenaline and dread. The lights in the morgue flickered but didn't go out. Whatever was happening, it wasn't another power outage. Franklin burst into the storage room to find Unit 5 standing open, the drawer extended, the body gone. But unlike last time, he wasn't alone. Walt Crenshaw was there, having responded to the same motion alert that Franklin's camera had triggered. And standing between them and the open unit was a figure in surgical scrubs, wearing a mask and gloves, holding a syringe filled with some clear liquid. The figure didn't run or try to fight. Instead, they simply set the syringe down on a nearby surface and slowly raised their hands, palms out, in a gesture of surrender. "You weren't supposed to be here," a woman's voice said from behind the mask. "The body was already dead. We're not hurting anyone. We're trying to help." Walt moved forward, his hand on his radio, ready to call for backup. But Franklin stopped him with a gesture. "Help who?" he asked. "Help with what?" The woman hesitated, then slowly removed her mask. She was younger than Franklin expected, maybe 30, with tired eyes that held a mixture of desperation and determination. People who are declared dead but aren't really dead. People like Robert Chen, who was written off by medical staff, but whose bodies were still fighting, still trying to survive. We have technology that can sometimes bring them back, but we need time and privacy to do it. The morgue is perfect because no one expects the dead to be anything but dead. Franklin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. You're experimenting on dead bodies without consent, without oversight, without any medical ethics at all. The woman shook her head emphatically. We're saving people who would otherwise be lost. The medical establishment has written them off, but with the right intervention, some of them can be revived. Chen is alive because of us. He's home with his family, living a normal life, because we didn't accept that his death was final. Walt's voice was hard. You broke into a hospital morgue, stole bodies, and performed unauthorized medical procedures. That's multiple felonies. The fact that one of your subjects survived doesn't justify any of it. The woman's expression turned sad. I know, but what would you do if you had the ability to save lives that everyone else had given up on? Would you let them die because the proper channels moved too slowly, because ethics committees needed years to approve trials, because society isn't ready to accept that death isn't always permanent? Before either Franklin or Walt could respond, the woman moved quickly, not toward them, but toward the open drawer of Unit 5. She reached in and retrieved something, the body they'd been guarding, except it wasn't just a body anymore. The elderly man's eyes were open, and he was breathing, shallow but steady. This is Marcus, the woman said. 3 hours ago, he was dead. Now he's alive. In another hour, he'll be awake enough to speak, and by tomorrow, he'll be able to go home to his wife of 47 years, who thinks she lost him 2 days ago. Franklin stared at the breathing body, at this impossible resurrection that he was witnessing. Every part of his training said this wasn't possible, that death was final and irreversible. But the evidence was right in front of him, undeniable and terrifying in its implications. How? He whispered. The woman smiled slightly. Would you believe me if I said it's a combination of advanced cryogenics, targeted cellular regeneration, and techniques borrowed from trauma medicine? Or would you rather I just say it's a miracle and leave it at that? Walt finally called for backup, his voice steady as he reported an intruder in the morgue. But he didn't try to restrain the woman, didn't try to take the revived man from her. Instead, he just stood there, watching, as uncertain as Franklin about what the right course of action was. The woman looked at both of them with something like sympathy. You're going to have to decide what you believe, she said. You're going to have to decide whether saving lives justifies breaking rules. I can't make that choice for you. When security arrived, minutes later, they found Franklin and Walt alone in the storage room. Unit 5 was open and empty, the body gone. No sign of the woman or anyone else. The security footage showed nothing. Franklin's hidden camera had mysteriously stopped recording at 2:34 a.m., and the hospital's official cameras showed no one entering or leaving the morgue. It was as if the entire encounter had been a shared hallucination, except that both Franklin and Walt remembered it in identical detail, and the body that should have been in Unit 5 was definitely, conclusively gone. Franklin never told anyone except Walt exactly what happened that night. The official report stated that another body had been stolen from the morgue, that the theft appeared to be connected to the previous incident, and that security protocols were being enhanced to prevent future occurrences. But Franklin knew that no amount of enhanced security would stop people who could make themselves invisible to cameras, who could move through locked doors, who could resurrect the dead and disappear without a trace. He still works in the morgue, still processes bodies according to strict protocols, still maintains his private documentation of every case. But now he looks at each body differently, wondering whether the death he's documenting is truly final or just a temporary state that someone, somewhere, might reverse. He thinks about Robert Chen, alive and home with his family, and about Marcus, who supposedly died but walked out of the morgue breathing. And he wonders how many other people have been saved by this mysterious woman and her impossible technology. How many deaths weren't really deaths at all? Walt Crenshaw transferred to a different facility 6 months after the second incident. He told Franklin it wasn't because he was scared, but because he couldn't do his job anymore, knowing that security was an illusion and that the rules he was supposed to enforce didn't apply to everyone. "I spent 15 years believing that I could keep people safe," Walt said during their final shift together. "Now I know that safety is just another story we tell ourselves. Some people exist outside the rules, and there's nothing we can do about it except decide whether we're okay with that." Franklin still isn't sure what he's okay with. On one level, what the woman and her organization are doing is clearly illegal and ethically questionable. But on another level, they're saving lives that would otherwise be lost, giving people second chances that conventional medicine says are impossible. The morgue has become a place where the impossible happens, where death is negotiable, where the boundaries Franklin thought were absolute turn out to be permeable and strange. Late at night, when the facility is quiet and Franklin is alone with the bodies, he sometimes wonders if they're really dead or just waiting. Waiting for someone to come with a syringe full of miracle solution, with techniques that can restart hearts and regenerate cells, with the audacity to believe that death is something that can be cheated if you're smart enough and bold enough and willing to break enough rules. He doesn't know if the woman will come back, doesn't know if there will be more stolen bodies and impossible resurrections. All he knows is that the morgue isn't what he thought it was. It's not an ending, but a way station, a place where some people pause before continuing a journey that should have been finished. And Franklin can't stop thinking about Unit 5, about the empty drawer that has now swallowed 2 bodies and released them back into the world of the living. He started leaving it empty, not using it for storage even though it's perfectly functional. It feels wrong somehow to put a body there, like he'd be offering it up to forces he doesn't understand and can't control. Unit 5 has become a quiet monument to the impossible, a reminder that Franklin's understanding of life and death is incomplete. The really terrifying part isn't what happened, but what might be happening everywhere, all the time, beyond his awareness. How many bodies pass through morgues around the country only to disappear and reappear among the living? How many people are walking around who should be dead but aren't, because someone intervened in the hours or days when everyone else thought their story was over? Franklin has started looking at obituaries differently, wondering if any of the deaths are permanent or if some are just temporary conditions that the right people with the right tools can reverse. He knows he should report what he saw, should tell someone in authority about the woman and her impossible claim of resurrection technology. But who would believe him? And even if they did believe him, what would they do? Shut down the operation that's apparently saving lives? Prosecute people for the crime of giving others second chances? Franklin isn't naive enough to think that what's happening is simple or unambiguous. For every life saved, there are probably complications he can't see, consequences that ripple out in ways he can't predict. So he remains silent, documenting bodies that might not stay dead, maintaining protocols that might not matter, and trying to reconcile his role as a morgue technician with the knowledge that the morgue is no longer a place of endings, but of pauses and possibilities. He's become complicit in something he doesn't fully understand, and that knowledge sits in his chest like a weight, heavy and inescapable. Walt was right. Security and safety are illusions, stories they tell themselves to make the chaos feel manageable. But Franklin has seen behind the curtain now, has witnessed the impossible made real, and he can never unknow what he's learned. Every night at 2:34 a.m., Franklin watches the clock and waits to see if the impossible will happen again. Most nights, nothing occurs. The morgue remains quiet. the bodies stay dead, and the world continues its normal operation. But Franklin knows that normal is just another illusion, that beneath the surface of routine and protocol, there are forces at work that he can barely comprehend. And he wonders, during those long quiet hours before dawn, whether the woman will come back, whether Unit 5 will open again, whether another body will walk out of his morgue and back into a life that medical science said was over. He has no answers, only questions that multiply every time he thinks about them. And so Franklin continues his work, continues to document and preserve and maintain the careful fiction that he understands what happens in the space between life and death. But he knows now that he understands nothing, that the morgue keeps secrets that go deeper than cold storage and steel drawers, that some bodies are just resting, and some deaths are just intermissions and longer stories that no one authorized him to read. Luther Kincaid had been working as a morgue technician at County General for 11 years, and in all that time, he'd developed a simple philosophy about the dead. They told stories, but only if you knew how to listen. Every scar, every tattoo, every callus on a palm or bend in a finger spoke volumes about who a person had been before they ended up on his steel table. The morgue was quiet in a way that nowhere else in the hospital could match, insulated from the chaos of the emergency room above by concrete and tile and the weight of silence that comes with finality. Luther preferred it that way. He'd never been good with the living, with their expectations and emotions and endless needs. The dead asked nothing of him except competence and respect, and those were things he could provide without hesitation. It was a Tuesday night in October when they brought in the body that would unravel everything Luther thought he understood about his own past. The call came at 3:17 a.m., and he was alone in the facility except for the security guard making rounds upstairs. Dr. Elsie Trumbull, the medical examiner, had gone home hours earlier after finishing the day's autopsies, leaving Luther to handle any intake that arrived during the night shift. He was used to the solitude, even preferred it. There was something meditative about the work when no one else was around. Just him and the bodies and the hum of the refrigeration units maintaining their constant 38 degrees. The paramedics wheeled in a black body bag on a gurney, and Luther noticed immediately that they seemed eager to leave. They handed him the paperwork without making eye contact, mumbled something about finding the body in an abandoned warehouse on the east side, and were gone before he could ask any follow-up questions. That wasn't entirely unusual. Some people couldn't handle being in the morgue even for a few minutes, as if death might be contagious. Luther unzipped the bag and began his initial examination, documenting everything with the methodical precision that had become second nature over the years. The body was male, approximately 45 to 50 years old, with no visible signs of trauma. No gunshot wounds, no stab marks, no obvious cause of death that Luther could determine from external examination. The man was dressed in ordinary clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, both worn but clean. His hands showed no defensive wounds, no bruising on the knuckles that might suggest a fight. His fingernails were trimmed and clean. Everything about him seemed completely unremarkable. The kind of case that would probably be ruled natural causes pending toxicology and autopsy results. Luther photographed the body from multiple angles, logged the clothing into evidence bags, and began the process of fingerprinting for identification. That's when the first strange detail emerged. The man had no fingerprints, not burned off or surgically removed, but naturally smooth, as if he'd been born without the whorls and loops that make each person unique. Luther had heard of a rare genetic condition called adermatoglyphia that caused this, but he'd never actually encountered it in all his years at the morgue. He made a note in his documentation and moved on to photographing distinguishing marks. The man had several scars, a thin line along his left forearm that looked surgical, a small circular mark on his right shoulder that might have been from a vaccination or a cigarette burn, and something else that made Luther stop and stare. On the inside of the man's left wrist, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a small tattoo. Not a design or symbol, but a series of numbers in faded black ink. The kind of tattoo that had been there for decades, slowly blurring into the skin. Luther leaned closer, adjusting his examination light to get a better look. The numbers were 092847, and underneath them, in even smaller letters, was a single word that made Luther's breath catch in his throat. The word was mercy, and Luther recognized it immediately because he'd seen those exact numbers and that exact word before. In a photograph he kept locked in a drawer at his apartment. A photograph of himself as a child standing next to a man whose face he could barely remember. Luther stepped back from the table, his hands suddenly shaking. He pulled off his gloves and walked to the sink, running cold water and splashing it on his face. This had to be a coincidence. The numbers could mean anything: a date, a code, an identifier from some organization or institution. And mercy was a common word, especially in medical contexts. There was no reason to think this had anything to do with his own past, with the fragments of memory he'd spent his entire adult life trying to ignore. But even as he told himself this, Luther knew he was lying. The tattoo was identical, down to the spacing and the font, to the one he'd seen in that photograph, the one his mother had given him before she died, the only evidence he had of a father who'd disappeared when Luther was 6 years old. He forced himself to return to the table and continue the examination. He had a job to do, protocols to follow, and letting his personal feelings interfere with his work was exactly the kind of unprofessional behavior he'd always prided himself on avoiding. He measured the body, noted the man's physical characteristics, and collected DNA samples for testing. The man's face was weathered but not unkind, with deep lines around the eyes and mouth that suggested he'd smiled often, or perhaps squinted in sunlight for many years. There was nothing remarkable about his features, nothing that would have made him stand out in a crowd. He was simply a middle-aged man who had died alone in an abandoned building, and if not for that tattoo, Luther would have processed him like any other unidentified body and moved on with his night. But the tattoo changed everything. Luther retrieved his phone from his locker and pulled up the photograph he kept stored in his encrypted files, the one he had never showed anyone and rarely looked at himself. The image showed a small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing next to a tall man with dark hair. The boy was Luther, recognizable despite the decades that separated that moment from this one. The man had his hand on Luther's shoulder, and his other arm was extended toward the camera in a gesture that might have been a wave. On the inside of that extended wrist, clearly visible in the photograph, was the tattoo. The numbers 092847 and the word mercy, identical to the one Luther had just documented on the body in his morgue. Luther sat down heavily on his rolling stool, the phone still clutched in his hand. This wasn't possible. His father had disappeared 37 years ago, walking out one morning and never coming back. Luther's mother had filed a missing person report, but the police had found nothing. No body, no evidence of foul play, no paper trail. His father had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a confused wife and a traumatized child who would grow up with only fragments of memory and that single photograph. Over the years, Luther had constructed various narratives to explain the disappearance. His father had started a new life somewhere else. He'd been involved in something illegal and had to run. He'd suffered some kind of breakdown and wandered off. None of the stories had ever felt true, but they'd been preferable to the alternative: that his father was dead and Luther would never know what happened to him. Now, here was a body with that exact tattoo, and Luther had no idea what to do with this information. If this was his father, where had he been for nearly 4 decades? Why had he never contacted his family? And why had he died alone in an abandoned warehouse with no identification and no fingerprints? The questions multiplied faster than Luther could process them, each one leading to darker possibilities. He knew he should call Dr. Trumbull immediately, should recuse himself from this case due to the potential personal connection. But something held him back. If this was his father, Luther needed to know the truth before anyone else got involved, before the case became official and he lost his chance to understand what had really happened. He spent the next hour conducting the most thorough external examination he'd ever performed, documenting every detail of the body with obsessive precision. The man had several other scars that suggested a life of hard physical labor or perhaps violence. His hands were calloused in ways that indicated regular use of tools or weapons. His teeth showed evidence of dental work that had been done decades ago, the kind of fillings that weren't commonly used anymore. But there were also signs of more recent care. His hair had been cut within the last few weeks. His toenails were trimmed. Someone had been taking care of this man, or he'd been taking care of himself, right up until whatever had killed him. Luther collected blood samples, hair samples, and swabs for DNA testing, knowing that definitive identification would take days or weeks through official channels. But he also collected an additional set of samples, ones he didn't log in the official documentation. Samples he intended to send to a private lab for expedited testing using his own DNA as a comparison. If this was his father, he needed to know as soon as possible, before he had to face Dr. S. Trumbull and Detective Jonas Merriweather, who would inevitably be assigned to investigate the death of an unidentified man. As dawn began to break outside, Luther finally wheeled the body into the cold storage unit, sliding the drawer closed with the hollow metallic sound that had become the soundtrack of his professional life. He cleaned the examination room with the same meticulous attention he gave to everything else, ensuring that no trace of his presence remained beyond what the official documentation required. Then he sat in his small office and stared at the paperwork, trying to decide what to report and what to keep to himself. The smart thing would be to tell the truth immediately, to explain the potential connection and let someone else handle the case. But Luther had spent his entire career in this basement, surrounded by the dead, specifically because he didn't trust the living to handle things properly. Dr. Trumbull arrived at 8 a.m., her usual time, and Luther briefed her on the overnight intake. He mentioned the lack of fingerprints, the absence of identification, and the need for dental records and DNA testing to establish identity. He did not mention the tattoo or his suspicions about who the man might be. Trumbull, a meticulous woman in her 60s who'd been doing this work longer than Luther had been alive, accepted his report without question. She had no reason to doubt him. In 11 years, he'd never given her cause for concern. His work was always precise, his documentation always thorough, his judgment always sound. The autopsy was scheduled for the following morning, which gave Luther 24 hours to decide what he was going to do. He went home to his small apartment, a space as sparse and functional as his office at the morgue, and tried to sleep. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw that tattoo, those numbers that connected him to a man he barely remembered. He thought about his mother, who died 5 years earlier without ever knowing what happened to her husband. She'd spent decades wondering, hoping, grieving, and eventually accepting that some questions would never be answered. Luther had made peace with his father's absence years ago, or at least he thought he had. Now that peace was shattered, replaced by a desperate need to understand. He couldn't sleep, so he spent the day researching. He pulled out boxes of his mother's belongings that he'd never had the heart to go through after her death, looking for any information about his father that might help him understand the tattoo. In a shoebox filled with photographs and papers, he found his father's discharge papers from the military. The man had served in the Army for 6 years, discharged honorably in 1978, 2 years before Luther was born. The numbers on the tattoo, 092847, didn't match his service number or any other identifier Luther could find in the documents. But the word mercy appeared again, this time in a letter his father had written to his mother from somewhere overseas, a location that had been redacted by military censors. The letter was brief and impersonal, the kind of communication that revealed nothing while seeming to say everything. I'm safe, and the work continues. The project at Mercy is making progress. I can't tell you more, but I think about you every day. I'll be home soon. The letter was dated March 1979, and whatever project his father had been working on, it had been classified enough to warrant redaction, even in personal correspondence. Luther had never known his father had been involved in anything beyond ordinary military service. His mother had always described him as a mechanic, someone who fixed things, not someone involved in classified projects with ominous names like Mercy. Luther spent hours searching online for any reference to a military project called Mercy, but found nothing concrete. There were dozens of operations and facilities with similar names, but none that matched the time frame or context of his father's service. He considered reaching out to military archives, but that would take weeks or months and would require explaining why he was inquiring. He was running out of time. The autopsy was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and once Dr. Trumbull opened the body, any chance Luther had of controlling the narrative would disappear. He needed answers now, and there was only one person who might be able to provide them. Detective Jonas Merriweather had been with the police department for 23 years, and in that time he'd worked with Luther on dozens of cases. Merriweather was the kind of detective who understood that bodies told stories, and he'd learned to trust Luther's interpretations of those stories. They had a professional relationship built on mutual respect and a shared appreciation for thoroughness. If Luther was going to tell anyone about his suspicions, Merriweather was the logical choice. But trust was a complicated thing, and Luther wasn't sure he was ready to expose his own connection to a case that might become a homicide investigation. At 11:00 p.m., 16 hours after the body had arrived, Luther returned to the morgue. He wasn't scheduled to work, but no one questioned his presence. He often came in during off hours to catch up on paperwork or prepare for upcoming autopsies. He used his key card to access the cold storage unit and pulled out the drawer containing the unidentified man. In the harsh fluorescent light, the body looked even more unremarkable than it had during the initial examination. Just another dead man awaiting autopsy, one of thousands that passed through this facility every year. But Luther knew this wasn't just another case, and the weight of that knowledge made his chest tight with anxiety. He photographed the tattoo again, this time with a scale marker and better lighting, documenting it from every angle. Then he did something he'd never done before in his entire career. He took a scalpel and made a small incision on the man's inner forearm, carefully removing a section of skin that contained the tattoo. He preserved it in formaldehyde, sealed it in a specimen jar, and labeled it with a code that only he would recognize. It was evidence tampering, the kind of thing that could cost him his career and possibly his freedom if anyone found out. But Luther justified it by telling himself he was preserving evidence, not destroying it. If this was his father, that tattoo was his only proof of identity, and he needed to ensure it wasn't lost during the autopsy process. The incision was small enough that it might not be noticed immediately, especially if Luther positioned the arm carefully during the autopsy. And if it was noticed, he could claim it had happened during the initial examination, an accidental cut while he was collecting samples. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best he could manage given the circumstances. He returned the body to cold storage and went to his office, where he sat in the dark and thought about what he'd just done. He'd crossed a line that he'd never imagined crossing, compromised his integrity in a way that made him feel sick. But he'd also done what he needed to do to protect the only evidence he had of his father's existence. The autopsy began at 9:00 a.m. the next morning. Dr. Trumbull was her usual efficient self, making the Y incision and beginning the systematic examination of internal organs. Luther assisted, as he always did, handing her instruments, taking notes, photographing each step of the process. Merriweather was there as well, standing at a respectful distance and observing. The detective had been called in because any unidentified body was treated as a potential homicide until proven otherwise. Luther focused on his work, trying to ignore the fact that he was helping to dissect a man who might be his father. The internal examination revealed the cause of death. The man had suffered a massive coronary event, a complete blockage of the left anterior descending artery that would have killed him within minutes. There were no signs of foul play, no toxins in his system, no evidence of anything except a heart that had simply stopped working. It was the most common cause of death that Luther encountered, and under any other circumstances it would have been a straightforward case. Natural causes, no further investigation required. But the lack of identification and the strange circumstances of the body's discovery meant that Merriweather would have to follow up, would have to try to figure out who this man was and why he'd died alone in an abandoned building. During the autopsy, Dr. Trumbull noticed the small incision on the man's forearm. She paused, examining it carefully, and Luther felt his heart rate spike with anxiety. "Did you document this during intake?" she asked, her voice neutral but curious. Luther nodded, keeping his expression professionally blank. "Yes, it was present when the body arrived. I assumed it was perimortem, possibly from falling against something in the warehouse." Trumbull accepted this explanation without further comment, and Luther exhaled slowly, relieved that his deception had worked. But he could feel Merriweather's eyes on him, the detective's trained instinct sensing that something was off, even if he couldn't identify what. After the autopsy concluded and the body was returned to storage, Merriweather pulled Luther aside. "I need you to be straight with me," the detective said quietly. "Is there something about this case that you're not telling me?" Luther had prepared for this question, had rehearsed his response, but actually, lying to Merriweather's face was harder than he'd anticipated. "I don't know what you mean," he said, hating how defensive he sounded. "It's a standard unidentified body, middle-aged male, died of a heart attack. What else is there to tell?" Merriweather studied him for a long moment, and Luther could see the detective weighing his options, deciding whether to push harder or let it go. Finally, Merriweather said, "I've worked with you for a long time, Luther. Long enough to know when something's bothering you. If there's anything I should know about this case, anything that might help me identify this guy, I need you to tell me." Luther wanted to confess everything, wanted to explain about the tattoo and the photograph and his missing father. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he said, "I'll let you know if I think of anything," and walked away before Merriweather could press further. The DNA results from the private lab came back 3 days later, sent to Luther's personal email with the subject line, "Paternity test results." He opened the message alone in his apartment, his hands shaking so badly he could barely click the mouse. The report was brief and definitive. The probability of paternity between Luther Kincaid and the unidentified deceased was 99.97%. The man on his table, the man he'd autopsied and documented and helped reduce to organs and tissues and fluids, was his father. After 37 years of absence, his father had come back to him in the only way the dead can, silent and beyond explanation. Luther sat with this knowledge for hours, trying to process emotions he couldn't name. Relief that he finally knew what had happened, Rage that his father had apparently been alive all these years and never contacted him. Grief for the relationship they'd never had and never would have. Confusion about everything that had led to this moment. The questions multiplied endlessly. Where had his father been? Why had he stayed away? What was the project at Mercy that had apparently consumed his life? And most importantly, why had he died alone in an abandoned warehouse with no identification, as if he'd been trying to erase himself from existence? Luther knew he should tell someone, should inform Dr. Trumbull and Merriweather about the identification and face the consequences of his deception. But he also knew that once he did, the case would be taken out of his hands. There would be investigations and questions and scrutiny, and whatever chance he had of understanding his father's life would disappear into official channels and redacted reports. So, instead, he did what he'd been trained to do. He investigated. He used the resources available to him as a morgue technician to dig deeper into his father's final days. The warehouse where the body had been found was scheduled for demolition, but Luther convinced the property manager to let him look around before the building came down. He told the manager he was trying to identify the deceased, which was technically true even if it left out crucial details. The warehouse was a cavernous space filled with debris and graffiti, the kind of place that attracted homeless people and drug users. But in one corner, sectioned off from the rest by a makeshift barrier of old furniture, Luther found something that made his blood run cold. Someone had been living there, and not just temporarily. There was a sleeping bag, a camp stove, and several boxes of belongings that included books, papers, and what looked like research materials. Luther photographed everything before touching anything, his training overriding his emotional response. Among the papers, he found notebooks filled with dense handwriting, mathematical equations that meant nothing to Luther, and diagrams of what might have been biological systems or mechanical designs. There were also photographs, dozens of them showing Luther at various ages. His first day of school, his high school graduation, his first day at the morgue. His father had been watching him, documenting his life from a distance, never making contact but always present in some invisible way. The notebooks referenced Mercy repeatedly, but the context was disturbing. Mercy protocol successfully suppressed for 72 hours. Subjects 4 through 9 exhibited identical degradation patterns. Primary carrier remains viable, but isolation protocols must be maintained. Luther had seen enough autopsy reports and medical documentation to recognize the language of human experimentation, and the implications made him feel sick. His father hadn't just been involved in some classified military project. He'd been a subject, possibly a volunteer, but more likely a victim of something that had kept him from living a normal life for decades. At the bottom of one box, Luther found a letter addressed to him. The envelope was sealed and yellowed with age, the handwriting shaky but legible. Luther sat on the concrete floor of the warehouse and opened it, his hands trembling. The letter was dated 3 weeks before his father's death, and it explained everything in brief, devastating terms. His father had been exposed to something during his military service, a biological agent that the military had been testing on soldiers without their knowledge or consent. The exposure had made him a carrier, someone who could spread the agent to others through close contact. To protect his family, he'd been forced to disappear, living in isolation and moving frequently to avoid accidentally infecting anyone. The letter explained that the tattoo was an identification number from the program, that Mercy was the code name for the project, and that dozens of other subjects had been scattered across the country, all living in similar isolation, all slowly dying from the long-term effects of exposure. His father wrote that he'd tried to get help, tried to expose the program, but everyone involved had either disappeared or been silenced. He'd spent decades just trying to survive, watching his son from a distance, unable to make contact for fear of putting Luther at risk. The letter ended with an apology. "I'm sorry I couldn't be the father you deserved. I'm sorry I had to choose between being your father and keeping you safe. I hope you can understand, even if you can't forgive me." Luther read the letter 3 times, trying to absorb the magnitude of what his father had endured. 37 years of isolation, of watching his son grow up from a distance, of knowing he could never explain or return or have any kind of normal life. The cruelty of it was staggering, made worse by the fact that it had been inflicted by the same government his father had served. Luther thought about his mother, who died without ever knowing the truth, who'd spent her life wondering if she'd done something wrong, if there had been signs she'd missed. The anger he felt was so intense it was almost paralyzing. He gathered all the evidence he could carry and left the warehouse, knowing he had a decision to make. He could expose everything, take the notebooks and photographs and letter to the authorities and demand an investigation into Project Mercy. But he also knew how these things worked. Any evidence would be classified, any investigation would be shut down by people with more power than he could imagine, and his father's sacrifice would be turned into another government secret. Or he could keep silent, let his father be buried as an unidentified man, and protect himself from the scrutiny that would inevitably follow any attempt to expose the truth. Luther spent days wrestling with this decision, going through the motions of his job while his mind churned with possibilities. He watched Dr. Trumbull sign the death certificate listing the cause as natural causes. He watched Merriweather close the case as an unidentified deceased with no suspicious circumstances. He watched his father's body being prepared for burial in the county cemetery, where unclaimed bodies were interred in unmarked graves. And he realized that this was probably what his father would have wanted: to disappear completely, to become truly anonymous, to finally be free of the burden he'd carried for so long. On the day of the burial, Luther attended the brief ceremony at the cemetery. He was the only one there besides the funeral home employees and the cemetery worker who operated the lowering device. No one questioned his presence. Morgue technicians sometimes attended burials of unidentified bodies, paying final respects to people who had no one else. As the plain wooden casket was lowered into the ground, Luther said goodbye to a father he'd never really known, a man who'd sacrificed everything to protect his family from something they'd never even known existed. It wasn't the closure Luther had imagined, but it was the only closure he was going to get. He kept the letter and one photograph, storing them in the same drawer where he kept the picture from his childhood. The rest of the evidence he destroyed, burning the notebooks and papers in his apartment's fireplace, watching as his father's decades of suffering were reduced to ash. He told himself he was protecting his father's memory, but he knew he was also protecting himself, avoiding the complications and questions and scrutiny that would come from revealing the truth. It was the coward's choice, maybe, but it was also the practical one. Some truths were too dangerous to expose, some stories too painful to tell. Detective Merriweather never stopped watching him, though. Luther could feel the detective's suspicion every time they worked together, could see the questions in Merriweather's eyes even if he never voiced them. About a month after the burial, Merriweather stopped by the morgue during Luther's shift, ostensibly to follow up on a different case, but really to probe for information. "That unidentified body from October," Merriweather said casually. "I've been thinking about it. Something about that case still bothers me." Luther kept his eyes on his work, carefully cataloging evidence from a recent autopsy. "Sometimes cases just don't have satisfying answers," he said. "Not everything can be solved." "True," Merriweather agreed. "But usually when something bothers me like this, it's because I'm missing something obvious. Like maybe there was information available that I didn't get." Luther could feel the detective's eyes on him. could sense the trap being carefully laid. "I documented everything I found," Luther said firmly. "If there was more to discover, it wasn't obvious to me either." Merriweather was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know what I think, Luther? I think that sometimes people keep secrets because they think they're protecting someone. But secrets have a way of becoming their own kind of prison." Luther finally looked up, meeting the detective's gaze directly. "Some prisons are more comfortable than others," he said quietly. "And some secrets are kept because exposing them would hurt more people than it would help." Merriweather studied him carefully, and Luther could see the detective making calculations, deciding whether to push harder or let it go. Finally, Merriweather nodded slowly. "If you ever decide you want to talk about anything, my door's open," he said. "Not as a detective, just as someone who's seen enough of death to know that carrying it alone is harder than it needs to be." Then he left, and Luther was alone again with the dead. In the months that followed, Luther noticed changes in himself that he couldn't fully explain. He found himself researching Project Mercy obsessively, looking for any trace of the program or its other victims. He created encrypted files documenting everything he'd learned, compiling evidence that he told himself he was preserving for some future reckoning, even though he knew he'd probably never use it. He started attending support groups for children of missing parents, listening to stories of loss and abandonment that echoed his own experience, though he never shared his own story. The secret he carried changed him in ways both subtle and profound, made him more isolated and more aware of how many people walked around carrying hidden trauma. The specimen jar containing his father's tattoo remained hidden in his apartment, preserved in formaldehyde like some kind of macabre relic. Luther would sometimes take it out and study it, those numbers and that single word that connected him to a man he'd barely known. He wondered if there were others out there like his father, other victims of Project Mercy still living in isolation, still carrying whatever biological burden had been imposed on them. He wondered if any of them would end up on his table someday, unidentified and unmourned, their stories locked inside bodies that could no longer speak. One night, almost a year after his father's death, Luther was working a late shift when he received an unusual delivery. A package addressed to him personally, left with security by a courier who'd vanished before anyone could ask questions. Inside was a file folder containing medical records for a patient named Subject 15, treated at various military facilities between 1978 and 1985 for complications related to Project Mercy. The records were heavily redacted, but enough remained to paint a picture of systematic abuse, experimental treatments, forced isolation, psychological manipulation. And attached to the file was a note in handwriting that Luther recognized from the letter his father had left him. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't survive long enough to deliver it personally. There are 6 others still alive. They deserve to know they're not alone. The coordinates are in the margins. Trust no one official." Luther spent the next week decoding the margins, finding tiny notations that translated into GPS coordinates scattered across the country. 6 other victims of Project Mercy, still living in hiding, still carrying their burden in isolation. His father's final message was clear. Luther had the resources and the position to help them, to at least acknowledge their existence and their suffering, even if he couldn't expose the program that had destroyed their lives. It was a responsibility Luther hadn't asked for and wasn't sure he wanted. Getting involved would mean risking everything he'd built, potentially exposing his own connection to the program, inviting scrutiny from the same people who'd forced his father to disappear. But it would also mean honoring his father's sacrifice, ensuring that at least some good came from all that suffering. Luther sat in his office surrounded by the dead and thought about what kind of person he wanted to be, what kind of legacy he wanted to leave. The morgue had always been his refuge, the place where he could maintain distance from the complicated emotions of the living. But maybe distance wasn't what he needed anymore. He started with the first set of coordinates, a location in rural Montana where Subject 8 was supposedly living. Luther took a week of vacation and drove out there, not knowing what he'd find or what he'd say if he found anything. The coordinates led to a small cabin in the mountains, isolated and difficult to access. An elderly man answered Luther's knock, his eyes wary and frightened, until Luther showed him the photograph of his father's tattoo. Then the man's face crumpled with something that might have been relief or grief or both. "I thought I was the only one left," the man said. "I thought they'd forgotten about us." Luther spent 3 days with Subject 8, whose real name was William, listening to stories that paralleled his father's experience. William had also been exposed during military service, had also been forced into isolation to prevent spread of the biological agent, had also watched his life slip away year by year while the government denied everything. He showed Luther his own tattoo, different numbers but the same word underneath. Mercy. They shared a bitter laugh at the irony. There had been no mercy in what was done to them, only cruelty disguised as necessity, sacrifice demanded without consent or compensation. Over the next several months, Luther visited 3 more of the survivors. Each had the same story, the same tattoo, the same decades of isolation and fear. They were elderly now, their bodies breaking down from age and from whatever they'd been exposed to all those years ago. Some were angry, demanding that Luther expose the program and get them justice. Others were resigned, too tired to fight anymore, just grateful to finally talk to someone who understood. Luther documented everything, recorded their stories, photographed their tattoos. He built a case that could potentially blow open one of the military's darkest secrets. But he also saw the cost that exposure would exact. These were fragile people living on the margins, surviving day by day through sheer determination and careful routine. Dragging them into the spotlight would destroy them, even if it succeeded in forcing accountability. And success was far from guaranteed. More likely, they'd be discredited, their evidence classified, their stories dismissed as the delusions of elderly people desperate for attention. Luther had worked in death long enough to know that justice was rare and closure was even rarer. Sometimes, the best you could hope for was acknowledgement, the simple recognition that suffering had occurred and mattered. He made his decision on a cold January night, 1 year and 3 months after his father's death. Luther compiled all his evidence into a single encrypted file and sent copies to 3 journalists he'd researched carefully, people with track records of handling sensitive material and protecting sources. He included detailed instructions. The story could only be published after all 6 surviving subjects had died, ensuring they'd be spared the trauma of media attention and government retaliation. Until then, the journalists were to investigate quietly, gather additional evidence, and prepare for eventual publication. It wasn't the immediate justice that part of him craved, but it was the responsible choice, the one that prioritized the victim's well-being over his own need for vengeance. Dr. Trumbull announced her retirement in February, and during her farewell party, she pulled Luther aside. "I've worked with a lot of technicians over the years," she said, "but you're the most dedicated I've ever known. Sometimes I worry that you're too dedicated, that you let this work consume you in ways that aren't healthy." Luther smiled, recognizing the kindness in her concern. "The work is important," he said simply. "Someone has to speak for the dead." Trumbull studied him with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Just make sure you're also living for the living," she said. "The dead will always be here. They're patient, but life doesn't wait." Her replacement was younger, less experienced, and more interested in efficiency than thoroughness. Luther found himself becoming the institutional memory of the morgue, the person who knew all the protocols and procedures, who could handle the difficult cases that required special attention. His reputation grew beyond the facility, and he began receiving requests to consult on unusual cases from other jurisdictions. It was gratifying in a way that surprised him. This recognition of his expertise, this acknowledgement that he provided value beyond just processing bodies. Detective Merriweather retired as well, but not before stopping by one final time. "I never figured out what you were hiding about that October case," he admitted. "But I did figure out that you had good reasons for hiding it. Sometimes I think about it, wonder if I should have pushed harder. Then I remember that some truths are too heavy for one person to carry, and maybe you were just trying to share the weight in the only way you knew how." Luther didn't confirm or deny anything, just shook the detective's hand and thanked him for years of professional collaboration. But after Merriweather left, Luther felt something shift inside him, a small loosening of the tension he'd carried since that October night. 3 years after his father's death, Luther received word that William, Subject 8, had passed away from complications of pneumonia. Then, Subject 12 died 6 months later from a stroke. One by one, the survivors were reaching the end of their long, isolated lives. Luther attended each funeral when he could, often the only mourner besides funeral home staff, paying respects on behalf of a father who'd cared enough about these strangers to document their existence in his final message. Each funeral felt like closing a chapter, like watching the last witnesses to a terrible crime disappear before justice could be served. But Luther had made his peace with that. He'd done what he could within the constraints of ethics and practicality. The evidence was preserved, the story would eventually be told, and the survivors had at least known in their final years that someone acknowledged their suffering. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. And sometimes something was all you could manage in the face of institutional cruelty and deliberate amnesia. The last survivor, Subject 3, died in the spring, 5 years after Luther had received his father's final message. Luther attended the funeral in Oregon, standing in the rain as the casket was lowered into the ground. That night, he sent a message to the 3 journalists, telling them the last witness was gone and they were free to pursue the story. He didn't know if they would, didn't know if anything would come of years of investigation and documentation, but he'd fulfilled his obligation to his father and to the others who'd suffered alongside him. What happened next was out of his hands. Luther continues to work in the morgue, continues to speak for the dead in the only way he knows how. But he carries something now that he didn't have before his father appeared on his table. A sense of purpose that extends beyond just processing bodies and documenting deaths. Every unidentified person who comes through his facility gets the same thorough attention, the same careful documentation, the same respect. Because Luther understands now that every body has a story, and some of those stories involve sacrifices and suffering that the world will never acknowledge. His job is to at least try to understand, to document what can be documented, to preserve what can be preserved. Sometimes, late at night, when the morgue is quiet and he's alone with his thoughts, Luther takes out the specimen jar containing his father's tattoo. He looks at those numbers and that word, and he thinks about the 6 others who bore similar marks, who lived and died in isolation, who sacrificed everything for reasons they never fully understood. He thinks about the file he compiled, the evidence he gathered, the story that might someday be told. And he wonders if his father would approve of the choices he made, if the balance between truth and protection was the right one. The answer never comes, because the dead keep their own counsel. But Luther has learned to live with uncertainty, to accept that some questions will never have satisfying answers. He has his father's letter, he has the evidence he preserved, and he has the knowledge that he did what he could with the impossible situation he was given. It's not closure, exactly, but it's something close enough to pass for it in the cold mathematics of death that govern his daily life. And every time a new body arrives, every time he documents scars and marks and the physical evidence of a life lived, Luther remembers that everyone carries secrets. Everyone has stories that die with them, and his job is simply to record what can be seen and to respect what remains hidden. Because some truths are too dangerous to expose, some stories too painful to tell, and sometimes the best you can do is bear witness in whatever small way you're able, knowing that even incomplete testimony is better than silence. Ephraim Quaid had heard the stories about Table 4 long before he started working at Riverside Medical Examiner's office. Every morgue has its legends, and Table 4 was Riverside's contribution to that tradition. According to the stories, bodies examined on Table 4 always showed unusual deformities by the time the autopsy was completed, distortions that hadn't been present during the initial examination. When Dr. Harriet Lowell had interviewed Ephraim for the morgue technician position 3 years ago, she'd dismissed it as superstitious nonsense. Table 4 is identical to the other examination tables, she'd said. Any apparent deformities are the result of post-mortem changes or confirmation bias. We're scientists here, Mr. Quaid, not believers in curses. Ephraim had accepted this explanation without question because it aligned with his own rationalist worldview. He'd studied forensic science in college, had done internships at 2 other medical examiner offices, and had never encountered anything that couldn't be explained through biology, chemistry, and physics. For the first 2 years of his employment, Ephraim used Table 4 regularly without incident. He performed dozens of autopsies on that surface, and bodies examined on Table 4 showed the same post-mortem changes as bodies examined anywhere else. Ephraim documented everything meticulously, and his records showed no pattern of unusual deformities or unexplained changes. The first time he noticed something strange was on a Thursday morning in October, almost exactly 3 years after he'd started working at Riverside. Dr. Lowell had been called to testify in court, leaving Ephraim to handle the preliminary examination of 2 traffic fatalities. He examined Patricia Chen first on Table 4, photographing her injuries according to standard protocol. The examination took about 45 minutes, and when Ephraim was finished, he covered the body with a sheet and moved on to examining the second victim on Table 3. Dr. Lowell returned from court around 2:00 p.m., and they began the formal autopsy on Patricia Chen. Ephraim wheeled the body from cold storage back to Table 4, removed the sheet, and immediately noticed something that made him pause. Chen's right hand, which had been normal during his morning examination, now showed a distinct deformity. The fingers were bent at unnatural angles, curved as if they'd been slowly twisted while the body was in storage. Ephraim stared at the hand, trying to remember if he'd missed this detail during his initial examination, but he was certain the fingers had been straight. He'd photographed the hands specifically, documented them as showing no unusual positioning beyond some minor abrasions. "The fingers weren't like this morning," Ephraim said. Dr. Lowell examined the hand carefully, manipulating the fingers and studying the joints. "Rigor mortis can cause unusual positioning," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. As the examination progressed, Ephraim noticed other changes that he was certain hadn't been present that morning. Chen's left foot was rotated inward at an extreme angle. Her jaw was slightly dislocated. Most disturbing, there were pressure marks on her torso, indentations in the skin that formed a pattern almost like fingerprints, as if someone had gripped her body with considerable force. After they'd finished with Chen and moved on to the second victim, Dr. Lowell pulled Ephraim aside. "I want you to review your preliminary examination photos of Chen. Compare them to what we just documented. I need to know if those deformities were present this morning or if they developed while the body was in storage. Ephraim spent the next hour doing exactly that, comparing his morning photographs frame by frame to the post-autopsy documentation. The evidence was undeniable. The finger curvature, the foot rotation, and the pressure marks had not been present during his initial examination. They had developed sometime between 10:30 a.m. and 2:00 p.m. Dr. Lowell studied the comparison images with growing concern. This doesn't make sense. Bodies don't develop new deformities after death unless they're subjected to external forces. Could someone have accessed cold storage and manipulated the body? Ephraim shook his head. The storage units are locked, and I have the only key during my shift. Dr. Lowell was quiet for a long moment, then said something that surprised him. Table 4. You examined her on table 4, didn't you? When Ephraim confirmed that he had, Dr. Lowell's expression became troubled. This is the third case in the last year where a body examined on table 4 showed deformities that weren't present initially. That table has been in this facility for 47 years. According to the records, it was purchased used from a hospital in Chicago that was closing down. The next day, Ephraim examined 3 bodies, a heart attack victim on table 1, a cancer patient on table 2, and an overdose case on table 4. He was extraordinarily thorough with each examination, taking dozens of photographs from every angle. When Dr. Lowell arrived and they began the autopsies, the first 2 bodies showed no unexpected changes. But when they wheeled the overdose victim from cold storage back to table 4, Ephraim immediately saw the deformities. The young man's hands were twisted into claw-like shapes, his spine was curved at an unnatural angle, and his facial features seemed distorted, as if the bones beneath the skin had shifted position. "This isn't possible," Ephraim said. "I examined him 3 hours ago. His hands were normal, his spine was straight." Dr. Lowell examined the body carefully, barely concealing her distress. These deformities are consistent with extreme mechanical pressure, as if the body was compressed or twisted with considerable force, but there's no bruising, no tissue damage that would indicate external trauma. It's as if the changes occurred from within. After they'd finished and returned the body to cold storage, Dr. Lowell made a decision. "We're not using table 4 anymore. I don't care if the other tables are occupied. We'll wait, we'll reschedule, we'll do whatever we have to do." Over the weekend, Ephraim researched everything he could find about the table's history. After hours of digging through old records and archived newspaper articles, he found a reference to St. Michael's Hospital, which had closed in 1977. The hospital had sold off its equipment in an auction, and Riverside had purchased several pieces, including examination tables. But Ephraim also found something that made his blood run cold. St. Michael's had been the site of a scandal in the 1960s and early 1970s involving unauthorized medical experiments. A doctor named Theodore Marsh had been conducting research on post-mortem tissue preservation, allegedly testing methods that could extend the viability of organs for transplant. But Marsh's experiments had gone far beyond ethical boundaries. He'd been accused of performing procedures on bodies without family consent, of manipulating remains in ways that violated both professional standards and basic human dignity. The scandal had eventually led to Marsh losing his medical license, and he'd disappeared from public record after 1973. Ephraim found a photograph of Marsh accompanying one of the articles, showing a gaunt man in his 50s with intense eyes and absolute certainty in his expression. In the background of the photo, barely visible, was what appeared to be an examination table. Ephraim brought this information to Dr. Lowell on Monday morning, and she studied the articles with growing alarm. If table 4 came from St. Michael's, and if Marsh used it for his experiments, could there be some residual contamination? They spent the next several days conducting a thorough examination of table 4. They swabbed every surface, collected samples from the drainage system, even removed small sections of the stainless steel for chemical analysis. Everything came back normal. No unusual bacteria, no exotic chemicals, no radioactive materials. By every measurable standard, Table 4 was just a table. But the deformities continued. Despite their agreement not to use Table 4, circumstances sometimes forced them to do so. And every time they did, the pattern repeated. Bodies that appeared normal during preliminary examination would show disturbing deformities by the time the autopsy began. Ephraim started documenting the specific nature of the deformities, looking for patterns. He noticed that the changes seemed to follow a consistent progression. Extremities were affected first. Fingers, toes, hands, feet, showing curvature and twisting. Then the spine would develop abnormal curvature. Finally, the facial bones would shift, creating distortions that made the deceased look almost inhuman. The progression was always the same, regardless of the individual's cause of death, age, or physical condition. One night, about 6 weeks after they'd first noticed the pattern, Ephraim was working alone during a late shift when he heard a sound like metal scraping against metal. He went to investigate and found the examination room apparently empty. But as Ephraim swept his flashlight across the room, he saw that Table 4's surface seemed to be moving slightly, rippling like water. He approached slowly and saw that the stainless steel was creating small waves that spread across the surface. He reached out to touch the table and immediately jerked his hand back. The metal was warm, almost hot, despite the cool temperature of the room. The patterns formed and reformed, and for a moment they seemed to spell out words: help, or possibly finish. The next morning, Ephraim showed Dr. Lowell the video he'd recorded, but it showed nothing unusual. When a new homicide victim arrived that afternoon needing immediate examination, all other tables were occupied, leaving only Table 4 available. Dr. Lowell decided they would do the preliminary examination together under constant observation. The examination took about 2 hours, during which nothing unusual happened. But as Dr. Lowell was completing her final notes, Ephraim noticed the victim's left hand had moved from palm down to palm up. Dr. Lowell, the hand has moved. As Dr. Lowell reached out to check the hand's position, the entire body jerked violently, as if hit by an electrical shock. Both jumped back, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, they watched as the body on Table 4 convulsed and twisted, the limbs bending at unnatural angles, the spine arching impossibly. The convulsions stopped as suddenly as they'd started, leaving the body twisted into the now familiar pattern of deformities. Ephraim stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. Dr. Lowell recovered first, her voice shaking. "We need to document this." After securing the body in cold storage, Dr. Lowell made a decision. "We're shutting down Table 4 permanently. I'll notify administration that it's contaminated or damaged or whatever excuse I need to use. But we're not using it again, and I'm going to recommend it be removed from the facility entirely." But removing Table 4 proved complicated. Administration said all medical equipment had to be decontaminated and recycled according to strict protocols. The process would take weeks, and in the meantime, the table would remain in the examination room. Dr. Lowell covered it with a tarp and moved it to a corner, but its presence remained, a hulking shape that dominated the room even when hidden. Strange things began happening with increasing frequency. Ephraim would arrive to find the tarp pulled partially aside. Equipment placed near the table would be moved or rearranged. Staff members reported hearing sounds from the examination room when no one was there. Metallic clanging, scraping noises, and occasionally what sounded like breathing. Ephraim set up a camera focused on Table 4, but the footage showed nothing unusual. Yet, almost every morning, he would find evidence that something had happened. The tarp moved, equipment disturbed, sometimes even wet footprints on the floor. The situation reached a breaking point 3 months later. Ephraim was working a night shift alone when he heard violent sounds from the examination room, metal crashing against metal, followed by what sounded unmistakably like a human scream. He ran to the room and found the tarp torn off table 4 and lying on the floor. The table's surface was covered in what looked like blood, though too dark and viscous to be normal. And standing beside the table was a figure in a white coat, hunched and twisted, with hands that were deformed in the same way as the bodies examined on table 4. The figure turned toward him, and Ephraim saw a face that might have been human once, but was now distorted beyond recognition. "Finish it," the figure said, its voice a rasping whisper. "Finish what he started. Make them perfect." Ephraim ran. He drove to Dr. Lowell's house and told her everything. Within an hour, police were at the morgue conducting a thorough search. They found nothing. No intruder, no blood on table 4, no evidence that anyone had been there. Security footage showed Ephraim working alone all evening. Dr. Lowell drove him home and told him to take a few days off. Ephraim spent those days researching Marsh obsessively. What he discovered suggested that Marsh's experiments had been far more extensive and disturbing than the newspaper articles had indicated. According to records in medical archives, Marsh had been attempting to create idealized forms, reshaping human bodies into configurations he believed represented perfection or transcendence. Marsh's notes described his belief that the human form was fundamentally flawed, that death provided an opportunity to correct these flaws through careful manipulation. Among Marsh's confiscated notes was a reference to the table of transformation, an examination surface he'd modified with embedded electrodes and chemical reservoirs, designed to continue his work even after his physical presence was no longer possible. Ephraim brought this information to Dr. Lowell, and together they made a decision. They would have table 4 removed immediately, regardless of proper disposal procedures. Dr. Lowell used her authority to authorize emergency removal, citing contamination. The removal crew arrived on a Friday afternoon, but when they entered the examination room, they found that table 4 had been completely destroyed. The stainless steel surface was torn and twisted, as if subjected to immense force from within. The legs were bent at impossible angles, and the entire structure had collapsed into a heap of mangled metal. No one could explain what had happened. The examination room had been locked with no unauthorized access. The damage wasn't consistent with any available tool or equipment. The removal crew cleared away the debris, and Ephraim watched as the twisted remains were loaded into a truck for disposal. He felt relief as the truck drove away, but the relief didn't last. In the weeks that followed, Ephraim noticed that bodies examined on the remaining tables were beginning to show subtle deformities. Nothing as dramatic as what had occurred on table 4, but small changes that shouldn't be happening. The pattern was spreading, as if whatever had corrupted table 4 was now affecting the other examination surfaces. Dr. Lowell made another decision. "We're closing the morgue. I'm recommending that autopsies be redirected to other facilities until we can completely renovate this space. New tables, new equipment, everything replaced." The renovation began 2 months later, and Ephraim was transferred to a neighboring facility. But before he left, he did one final examination of the room where table 4 had stood. As he photographed the empty space, he noticed something carved into the floor where table 4's legs had rested. The marks were faint but formed words. "Transformation continues." Ephraim never returned to Riverside. Even after the renovation was complete, he couldn't bring himself to go back. He took a position in a different city. Dr. Lowell retired early, unable to maintain her rationalist worldview in the face of what had happened. Years have passed, and Ephraim has built a successful career at his new facility. But he never talks about his time at Riverside, never mentions Table 4 or the deformities or the figure he saw that night. But sometimes, during night shifts when he's alone with the bodies, Ephraim notices small changes. A finger bent at an unusual angle, a spine showing slight curvature, facial features subtly distorted. The changes are minor, easily explained by post-mortem processes, but they remind him of what he saw at Riverside. Ephraim has started documenting these minor deformities, maintaining his own private database. He's reached out quietly to other morgue technicians, asking if they've noticed unusual post-mortem changes. Most say no, but a few admit they've seen things they can't explain. Ephraim collects these reports, building a case that he doesn't yet know how to present. The examination table at Ephraim's current facility is new, purchased just 3 years ago. It should be completely free of any contamination or corruption from Marsh's experiments. But Ephraim has started noticing subtle changes in bodies examined on this table, too. Nothing dramatic yet, just small distortions that might be coincidence or might be the beginning of something worse. He hasn't told anyone about these observations. He's not sure what good it would do. So he continues his work, examining bodies with thoroughness and professionalism, while privately tracking the spread of unexplained deformities. He's become a chronicler of transformation, documenting a phenomenon that science doesn't acknowledge. Late at night, when Ephraim is alone in the examination room, he sometimes feels like he's not really alone, like there's a presence watching from the corners, assessing his work, judging whether the bodies he examines are being properly prepared for transformation. Ephraim has started wondering if all examination tables carry some residue of the transformations they've witnessed, if metal can absorb the intentions and procedures performed upon its surface. If that's true, then every morgue in the world might be compromised, every examination surface slowly accumulating corrupting influence. The dead reshaping themselves according to patterns that exist outside of medical understanding, outside of scientific law, in spaces where Marsh's vision of transformation continues to influence reality. The table at his current facility gleams under the fluorescent lights, its stainless steel surface clean and sterile and waiting. Ephraim approaches it with the mixture of dread and determination that has become his constant companion. Another body awaits examination, another opportunity to witness whether the corruption continues to spread. He pulls on his gloves, adjusts his examination light, and begins the careful documentation that is both his duty and his defense against the impossible. And in the quiet moments between examinations, when the morgue is still and the fluorescent lights hum their constant song, Ephraim thinks about Table 4 and the figure he saw that night. He thinks about Marsh and his obsession with perfection and transformation, and he wonders if the changes he's documenting are really deformities, or if they represent something else. Some evolution that only looks like corruption because he doesn't understand its purpose. Maybe Marsh's vision wasn't madness, but prophecy. Maybe the transformation of bodies on examination tables is exactly what was intended. A slow reshaping of death itself into something that serves purposes Ephraim can't yet comprehend. These thoughts disturb him more than any alternative because they suggest that the horror might have meaning, might be part of some larger pattern that's still unfolding. And if that's true, then nothing Ephraim documents or reports will make any difference. The transformation will continue regardless of human knowledge or resistance, reshaping bodies according to designs that preceded medical science and will outlast it. All he can do is witness and record, marking each stage of the process as it spreads from table to table, morgue to morgue, until every examination surface in the world carries Marsh's corrupting influence. Ephraim begins another examination, his hand steady despite the dread in his chest. The body on the table appears normal for now, but he knows that could change. He'll photograph it all, measure it all, note it all in his private records. And then he'll move on to the next case, and the next, each one a potential transformation. Each one another piece of evidence in a case that no court will ever hear, and no jury will ever judge. Because this is the truth that Ephraim has learned. Some corruptions can't be stopped, only witnessed. Some transformations continue regardless of human intervention. And some examination tables carry legacies that outlast their creators, reshaping the dead according to visions of perfection that the living were never meant to understand.